Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Morning, both of us in New York State, with Professor Solomon Polachek of the State University of New York, Binghamton, or University of Binghamton. He is, I think it's fair to say, one of the real founders of the field of gender economics, in the sense that in his PhD thesis, which, as I remember, was published maybe in 74, 75, in one of the top journals, he really pioneered seriously looking at the determinants of gender inequality. And so for that reason, the fact he's been working on this topic off and on for, my gosh, almost a half a century now. It's true, it's a half a century. It's a real pleasure to have him here. Good morning, Saul. How you doing?
Good morning, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see you.
I'd like to ask a few questions about gender pay gap, why it exists, what can be done. First of all, what contributes to it? Why is there a gender pay gap?
Well, I think the main determinant of the gender wage gap is basically marriage and children. The gender wage gap has always been smallest for never married men and women, and largest for married once spouse present men and women with children. And that statistic is virtually true for every country for which there's data. And as illustrated in my IZA World of Labor article, using Luxembourg income study data for 30 countries, the gender earnings gap is far smaller for those with no partners and no children. It averaged about 9% across all those 30 countries. But for those people that are partnered with children, the average gap is closer to 40%. So bottom line is that it's 4 times higher for men and women that are partnered with children compared to men and women that are unpartnered without children. And back when I did my first studies that you referred to a long time ago, using, at that time, it was 1960 census data. So it was data essentially for people that were living and working in the late 1950s, specifically 1959. The so-called motherhood penalty, which is what they call it now, was about 55%. So the gap was much larger then, but it has been shrinking. And it's been shrinking essentially for most countries. So the gap was largest, or is largest, for those married with children, smallest for singles. It's true essentially across every single country. And indeed, though, the gap has been narrowing over time. And
let me interrupt and ask you a question. Why has it been narrowing? I knew it was narrowing in the U.S., but I didn't realize that was a universal phenomenon. Is it because people are having fewer kids, or is there more to it than that?
No, I think it's basically, as you say, because people are having fewer kids, and the work behavior of men and women are changing. So the labor force participation rate for women is rising, and it's been rising for a long time. The labor force participation rate for men has been slowly going down just slightly. And this is true for over the lifetime as well. That is the life cycle. So basically, women or families are having fewer children, and wives are working more over their lifetime for essentially most countries. There actually is an interesting exception. And the interesting exception that we were looking at recently is China. So what happened in China is they started essentially a one-child policy, which was formal in the late 70s, 1980, but it was gradual. And during the one-child policy, essentially fertility rates went down tremendously. And what we can see is that essentially the division of labor between husband and wife kind of went down. Put it another way, husbands and wives were getting to be more comparable in terms of their wage status, their ages, and so on. But what happened in the 1980s is that a number of these provinces were giving one-child exceptions. So there were exceptions to the one-child policy, which basically implied that fertility rates increased for those people that got those one-child exceptions. And these one-child exceptions, the timing varied across provinces, and it varied across people. So it turned out that those people that got the one-child exceptions had more children. And once those laws were passed, it turns out that the marital patterns changed. And so whereas there was it turned out then that the age gap between husbands and wives increased, as did the education gap, and that caused an increase in the division of labor in the home, and actually that caused a widening in the husband-wife wage gap. And so essentially then China, after there were these exceptions to the one-child policy, was differed from the trend in most other countries. Namely, there was actually an increase in the wage gap, and that bucked the global trend.
I saw that recently, I think just this week, that China is talking about allowing 3 children.
Correct.
Because they're terribly bothered by the fact the population is about to peak. So what you're saying implies, if I'm not mistaken, that China is going to see an ever widening of that wage gap unless they do something else. Is that correct?
I'm not sure about forever, because eventually they'll reach the equilibrium. But if we move from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, and people don't have free choice, it's not clear that everyone will have 3 children, but the more children, presumably the greater the division of labor in the home, and presumably the lower the lifetime labor force participation of the wife relative to the husband, and the bigger the wage gap.
Right. Sounds like they might be trying to approximate the United States in the 1950s when we were growing up, which is, I'm not sure that's a great desideratum. Let me ask you something else that you said, that even taking never married singles, those who aren't going to be married, there still is a 9% wage gap. I'm quoting you from earlier in our talk. Right. Okay, that's not insubstantial. Right. What's causing that?
Well, that's actually a good question. My hunch is that that's a little bit of an overestimate. And the reason it's an overestimate is that a number of people that are single have expectations of getting married. And when you have an expectation of getting married, then that affects the kinds of courses you take in high school, college, and the kinds of jobs you take. And there is a lot of evidence that men and women do choose different kinds of jobs, and part of that is based essentially on what one's expectation is for lifetime work. And indeed, that 9% is an overall figure across all 30 countries, and that data was from the early 2000s, or around the 2005 to 10 period, plus or minus. But in some countries, it turns out that single women make more than single men, and in some countries the gap is bigger than 9. That was an average. But in the U.S., for about in the year 2020, the gap in wages between men and women for 16 to 24-year-olds was less than 5%, about 4.9%. So in essence, that for some groups, the gap is relatively small. Now you can claim that 4.9% is too large, and perhaps it is too large, but it's certainly not 40%. And so the bulk really of the gap is really marriage and children.
Okay, let me ask you a question then. Okay, what can we do about this other than disallowing marriage and saying no more kids, okay, which is not going to happen? What can governments do to ameliorate this problem?
Okay, well, I've been long advocating for better daycare facilities and making them more affordable. And the reason I claim that that's an excellent policy is, well, actually for a couple reasons. One is that the prime time that women drop out of the labor force is essentially when they have young children. And if one could create incentives to not drop out of the labor force during that time period, then that could create an incentive for continuous lifetime labor force participation, which would then enable women to take the kind of jobs which will enable them to quickly or to be able to move up the job ladder. And if you go back to that IZA World of Labor article that I did, there's a really telling table right at or graph right at the beginning, and it really struck me when I saw that data. And that is that in countries, if you look at plot of country availability of daycare and the gender wage gap, you find that in countries that have more available or better usage of daycare, the male-female wage gap is appreciably smaller. And I think that's very telling. And the other thing is there's some debate, is daycare good or bad for the children? And one could argue both ways. I don't know that literature. That's more psychology type literature and biological type literature, health type literature. But there is a bit of research in economics nowadays that early childhood education turns out to be very, very valuable and pay high returns. So if indeed that is true, then making daycare available and affordable could actually pay very good dividends, not just for the mothers, not just for decreasing the gender wage gap, but for increasing productivity in the long run for the country.
I agree personally completely, but I always worry when a policy that is doing something that we're interested in, lowering the gender wage gap, that we also claim it has beneficial side effects. I worry about some unintended consequence that I'm missing. I can't see any here. Let me ask you one other question, okay? Certainly in the case of racial discrimination, people are very aware that there are unconscious discrimination activities going on in the workplace, okay? And even if people will say they're not discriminating. Is this as true, or do you see any signs of this or any evidence of it in research on the gender wage gap?
Well, the answer. The answer I think is that is possible, and I think one way that could come about, but again, it's rooted in family and children, and that kind of discrimination I think could be called statistical discrimination, essentially, where employers have preconceived notions that someone might drop out of the labor force. And I'll tell you where I actually saw some evidence of that. So as you well know, there's a lot of talk in the newspaper nowadays about paid family leave. The United States is one of the few developed countries that doesn't have a nationwide program for paid family leave, but a number of states actually have started paid family leave. California was the first in the U.S. with paid family leave. And the evidence that I have seen and worked with is that when California, or after California passed paid family leave, it turned out that the unemployment rate for women that were of childbearing age actually went up relative to older women and women in other states. Now, one possible reason for this is that employers, namely firms, were more reluctant to hire women that could take time off, and therefore that increased the duration of unemployment for these reasons. Why would firms be reluctant? Well, maybe because of statistical discrimination, because they have these notions that with this new law of paid family leave, a number of the people that were young women that they hired of childbearing age might drop out for maybe 6 months or so, which could be costly to the firm, and therefore they wouldn't want to hire them. So it is quite possible that there could be a type of discrimination like statistical discrimination, which could very much harm women.
Okay, now let me ask a final question then, okay? You looked at immense numbers of countries, okay, and you found differences in the average male-female or female-male earnings ratio. Question is, once one adjusts for things like family size, age at marriage, education differences, blah, 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 how much is due to pure international differences in culture/institutions?
I don't know how much is due to culture and institutions, but I will say that there could be a bit of that. But a lot of these cultural differences really manifest themselves in what I would call the division of labor in the home, in the roles of husbands versus wives. And there are a lot of actually cultural differences or differences that are not quite culture, but development type differences. And let me give you one neat example. When we talk about division of labor in the home, division of labor in the home really comes about because some people claim that men have a comparative advantage in the marketplace. Well, what's the comparative advantage? Some people claim that that women are more productive in the household. I don't buy that. I think everyone's equally productive. But what is interesting is that on average, husbands are older than wives. And that's true in virtually every single country except for one. So I looked at data for 200 and some countries, about 230 countries for which there's data. It's called the singlet mean age at marriage. And you can get the singlet mean age at marriage for men and women. And in every single country, husbands are older than wives. Now, what does that mean? It means that at the onset of marriage, a husband on average has more work experience and hence a higher wage. But one country is the exception, and that's San Marino. And in San Marino...
Stop. We're not going to worry about San Marino. They also had, by the way, the highest death rate from COVID for quite a while of anywhere in the world. But it's not, I mean, as much as I would like to be there, I wouldn't count San Marino in this comparison.
Well, that's the only single exception. And the gap is that women are 0.1 of a year older than men. The average around the world is around 2 years or plus or minus. But
that's been going down, though. So that's been going down.
It's definitely going down. It's definitely going down, except when China gave the exceptions to that one-child policy, it actually went up in China. Yeah. But the other interesting thing, because you were talking about differences across countries, and this is, I think, very interesting, is in some countries, the age gap is gigantic by global standards, and that's in some of the African countries. So I don't remember the exact African country, but it's as high as 9 years in one country, 8.9, 9.1, something in that ballpark. Now, why is the age gap so high between husbands and wives in Africa? Well, the answer is in those countries, there's a very high demand for children, in part because of the higher infant mortality rate, and in part because children can be used essentially on the family farm. So because there's a very high demand for children related to the productivity of children, related to the infant mortality rate, that implied that the advantages of marrying a fertile woman and for a woman marrying a man that has some substance, which is older, therefore widened the age gap between husbands and wives, and that exacerbated the division of labor. Right. So to the extent you talked about and asked about culture, this isn't quite culture. It's basically an institutional difference between essentially infant mortality rates, but that caused a very, very wide gap in the ages between husbands and wives in Africa relative to the rest of the world, which exacerbated the division of labor and had some implications with respect to the gender wage gap.
Fascinating. Look, we got to quit now. I have been enjoying this immensely. I've actually learned something, which I don't always do in these interviews. So I want to thank Saul Polachek, longtime professor of economics and one of the real pioneers in the field, for joining me this morning. Thank you very much, Saul.
And thank you, Dan. I enjoy talking to you as always.
Okay, a pleasure. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.